So this is episode 1. We have no idea where this is going to go, but in episode 1, who do we talk with, David?
In episode 1, we're going to be talking with Professor John Krakauer from Johns Hopkins University. John is a neurologist, he is a scientist, and he focuses most of his time and effort on trying to treat stroke and all of the consequences that happen after someone survives a stroke. In terms of his scientific background and scientific legacy, John is one of those guys that I have been watching for decades, and when I'm thinking of an idea that I want to explore or I want to run an experiment on, it often saves me a lot of time and effort and frustration to Google John's name and the topic and realize that he did the experiment and learned about the thing that I was trying to learn about 5 years before I thought about it. He's always been on the bleeding edge of progress. He has always been the person in the field who is encouraging us to think outside of the box, to be thinking about what we're really doing as clinicians or what we're really doing as engineers that is different from what has gone before, as opposed to trying to maintain the status quo and fail in the same way that 3 or 4 other companies or clinicians have failed before. So what I really admire about John in terms of the topic of this podcast, in terms of how do we accelerate new ideas and new technologies into the clinical world, is John is not telling us to love all technologies and just accept the technology just for the sake of it's shiny and new, so we should be doing it. He encourages us to think. He encourages us to remember our physiology, remember our anatomy, and think about, does this really have a role in what we're trying to achieve with patients? We're not just going to let it into our clinic because it's shiny or because it looks sexy or because, it's on the latest Apple commercial. So that's what I really respect about John and his approach. And I think that, this conversation will really bring us to some of that, about how to think about these things and how to approach technology productively.
All right, so that frames this episode well. And since this is episode 1 of a podcast, and everybody and their mom has a podcast, what are you trying to do? How do you want to frame why the audience should know why we're creating this podcast? What does this podcast seek to do? I think you touched on it a few times in your answer about John, but how would you answer that?
Yeah, this podcast is all about exploring why it takes so long for certain therapies or certain ideas that clearly should be adopted into mainstream medicine. Why is it taking so long for this to happen? Why is it taking so long for us to forget our old ideas and our old biases and embrace what's new and what can really help our patients? Within the context of that topic, within the context of why does it take so long for us to change paradigms and move forward, we have someone who has spent his entire career doing that, telling us about where all the landmines are, what should we, yes, it's a great idea to embrace new technology, but what should we be doing in the meantime? How should we be doing it thoughtfully? How should we be doing it in a way that isn't just placing us into yet another camp, which is, hey, I'm the technology camp. Everything technological is good and everything low tech is bad. That's not how we feel at all. That's not the mission at the Abilities Research Center or at Mount Sinai in the Department of Rehab when we built a division of rehabilitation innovation. That's not how we felt about technology, that it's always the best and we should always be adopting it. But we were asking the question, in the cases where it is clearly a win-win, why is it taking so long to adopt? And as we explore the answer to that question, it's important to hear from voices who really advocate for us to be very thoughtful and careful about the choices we're making. How are you? We don't, we're just recording everything, so
I'm good. I'm good. I'm actually good.
Well, thank you for making the time. You just tell me when you're running out of steam or you think the conversation is no longer interesting, and we can stop.
Now.
This is Disrupting Innovation with Dr. David Petrino.
We've started this new podcast. The name of the podcast is Disrupting Innovation. The whole idea behind it is we're trying to understand why it takes so long to go from bench to bedside. We're trying to understand why companies fail. We're trying to understand why health systems fail to give people the care that they need. We try to understand why government agencies are either not funding the right sort of research or not choosing to strategically target research that will be rapidly translated, and have conversations with smart people like yourself and try and understand, what's going on, what the problem is. So I suppose the way we could start is, do you want to tell us who you are and what you do?
Yes. So my name is John Krakauer. I'm a professor of neurology, neuroscience, and physical medicine and rehabilitation at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. I am also an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute, and I also have a position in neuroscience at the Champollion Center for the Unknown in Lisbon. My interests are quite diverse. I would say that, clinically, I've been a stroke neurologist for longer than I care to admit. Scientifically, I've always been very interested in computational and experimental motor control studies in humans. I've also been very interested in recovery after injury to the nervous system, also mainly in humans, but I'm doing work in mice and monkeys. I'd like to believe that those two areas are connected in so much that I believe that one can come up with training protocols based on neuroscientific principles that would be beneficial to repairing the nervous system. I'll stop there.
Yeah, there's more, but you wouldn't want to appear to be full of yourself or brag or anything like that, because
God forbid.
So I'll do it for you. In certain circles, I'm considered to be somewhat innovative. What I've always sort of, having watched your career, what I've always sort of found to be the case is, if I have a novel idea and I search your name and the novel idea you've probably published on it 5 or 7 years ago, has kind of been my experience, my very honest experience of watching your career and watching your work. So I get very excited always to have these conversations with you, because I feel like we're on the same wavelength, even if you're, running a few steps ahead. And I think that you're probably uniquely positioned in the field. If I could be slightly reductionist and talk about health technology from the standpoint of neurological recovery, because I know that your contributions to human performance are pretty spectacular. But if we just talk about people who are trying to recover from stroke, and or some sort of neurological injury, and we talk about the contributions that you've made, you see a lot. You see a lot of the research, you see a lot of the technology emerging. What are our fundamental issues in coming up with new ideas? Let's start there.
Yeah, maybe just before we get to that, I'll just give a sort of a little anecdote that, for me, I think it's kind of personal watershed, or something that comes back to me, haunts me and inspires me in equal measure. I was the stroke attending at Hopkins. We cover the units in a rotating roster, and that was my week. They brought in, I can't remember how they got to Hopkins, but they were emergently brought into Johns Hopkins, a young basketball player. I think he must have been in his early 20s. And he had thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura, a rare and dangerous clotting disorder that is almost uniformly fatal if it's not treated quickly. So he came to us, I diagnosed him with GTP, and we treated him. And I think, in a sense, it was one of those occasions where, quite unequivocally, we saved his life. But because it's a clotting disorder, he had a stroke. So you can imagine this, let's say, 23, 24-year-old, athlete with a hemiparesis, and we looked after him in the stroke unit, and then he went to the rehab unit. And, I wanted to see how he was doing, so I walked over, after he'd been transferred from my unit to the rehab unit, and I went in to see him. It must have been, I don't know, early evening, everything was quiet. And, he was extremely nice, hello, doc. But he was there with his, paralyzed remember which side it was. And he said to me, I'm not, something along the lines, I'm not trying to be ungrateful, but, why can't I be doing something? I just lie here. And, I'm an athlete. And why couldn't I be doing something while I'm here in the room? And I remember thinking, this is just unacceptable. He's going to spend the whole evening alone in the room. He's going to spend substantial portions of his time during the day alone in his room, not doing anything with his arm and hand. And I just felt kind of inadequate. I felt like this just couldn't be, that there weren't technologies that we could begin to develop and adapt to let people do more after injury, especially in, we can talk about these periods early when there's more plasticity. And so that galvanized me in a way. I just thought, I'm just not going to do this. We've got to find a way to provide technology-inflected behavioral experiences that can be used to greatly increase the dose and intensity of behavioral training after injury, especially in people that motivated. And, I think in a nutshell, anyone who isn't in medicine listening to this will go, well, yeah, we didn't know people just tend to lie around in bed most of the time. And so one could tell a story about, well, how did it ever get there? Why didn't somebody else have that moment? Maybe they did, and they just gave up, when they were asked to do something like that. The question, your whole podcast could be, well, why haven't we done that? And why are we still struggling to do it?
Thank you for starting with this story, because I think it actually centralizes some. We could go down a list. We could, I think there's not a lot of people out there. I'll say there's no one out there just for you, because I don't want to spend all time arguing. But there's no one out there that knows as much about stroke recovery as you do. Let's start with educating people on what we know. So you've got a gentleman lying in front of you who says, I want to be moving nonstop. Why can't I be doing my rehab right now? What more could I be doing? First question, I suppose, is he right? Is there a cap on what he could be doing? Is there a point where we could be pushing him that would be causing harm? Because these are all things that frame people's reasons for saying no. I have observed to new technology is, oh, well, what if their tone gets worse? Or what happens if they fall over while you're not watching? So let's start to cross out some of these dumb reasons for saying no.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. It's good exercise to try and be structured in answering this. It is complex. So first of all, what we're talking about here, and what I tend to do research on is the motor deficits after stroke, which are the most common. So just to be clear, stroke comes in two principal flavors. When an artery is clogged and when an artery bursts, they lead to death of tissue wherever that blood vessel was supplying. The problem with the motor system is that it's quite well represented, and so it's commonly damaged. Usually affect one side, which is contralateral to where your stroke was. So if you have a right hemispheric stroke, you'll have a left-sided motor deficit and vice versa. We feel that the reason why you do have this hemiparetic phenotype, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is because primarily in humans, you interrupt this very important descending pathway down from the brain to the spinal cord called the corticospinal tract. This is an incredible tract that the brain allows the brain to control various circuits along its path down into the spinal cord, and it leads to enormous amounts of dexterity and control. But the problem is that in humans, it looks as though we put all our eggs in that one cable, and so if you lose it, you're more devastated than even our closest primate cousins, for example, chimpanzees. And then the whole question comes down to how much of it have you lost? How much can you do through behavioral intervention to upregulate what you have residually? We feel that you have more chance of bringing back what you have left and upregulating the residual corticospinal tract early, because there's this special window of enhanced plasticity, enhanced responsiveness to training, that in humans we think lasts about 1.5 months, maybe 3. So that gentleman is not able to move his arm and his hand because he's damaged this corticospinal tract. And the question is could we be doing more to bring the remaining component back online, with the assumption that he has got some remaining descending pathways? In most cases, patients do. Now, the concern has been that patients may be too tired to do the intense training that is required. And then there's been this belief going back into the 90s that intense training can actually expand infarct size, cause more damage. That's a whole can of worms. Needless to say, the data don't really support that, with the exception of very large strokes, perhaps. The point is somewhat moot, because we feel like that's only really an issue within the first 5 days of stroke, which is your average length of stay in a stroke unit. So when you take into account even qualifications in those original studies, you take into account the window where you have to worry, you have to just look at that subset of strokes that are really large. Once you take all those things aside, then most patients simply should be given higher doses and intensities of training right away. And as you know, we've done studies in the mouse where we do it within a day, right? And they get a massive benefit. Whereas if you wait in a mouse even 1 week, you don't get the same benefit. So there's a clicking clock, and it's not that different from thrombolysis, and we need to be doing something. And finally, if it was a total lesion, there are ways now to establish what the remaining integrity is, to give some sense of whether it's worth throwing the kitchen sink at someone. So for all those reasons, the default should be see if they have residual movement, find a way to challenge them on their residual movement, and start right away. And the science does not support the lack of intervention. I think it's to do with culture, economics, and entrenched opinions that have long since become recalcitrant to scientific evidence.
Yeah, totally agree. One of the things that I often say when all of these reasons for not adopting new things come on, and you hear the same things over and over again, and really I tend to just swipe them all out the way and say, I think what you're telling me is that it's hard to change your behavior as a clinician, which is also, very challenging to your patients, because our whole job should be behavioral change, both in our patients and in our own practice.
We have now, as you know, developed some hand devices and games that can actually be placed in the room, like for that young man, where you have your arm in some sort of soft cladding so that you're well positioned, and then you can take the residual dexterity and strength you have, for example, in the hand, and start to play with systems, force sensors that can detect micro movements, small isometric forces, which still require dexterity, and you can place it in their room. And we've just written an IRB called the Nighttime Study, where we're going to be doing just that. So it's perfectly doable. You can have a resident or a family member or a nurse can help set it up fairly quickly, and you're on your way. And I can't for the life of me think of what the risk is. Of course, you don't want the patient getting out of bed on their own and the risks of falls. Absolutely. But when it comes to cognitive and upper limb tasks, you can actually have them secure in bed and find ways that they can continue to train at no risk to themselves, and considerably increase the dose that they get during their inpatient stay. But you have to develop the technology. It has to be purchased. You have to train on it. You have to be able to quantify it. You have to be able to adjust it. Yeah, that's all true. But IVs get adjusted, beds get adjusted, people get taken out of bed to chair and out of bed to bathroom. There are all sorts of little maneuvers and moments that occur between the patient and another human being. And that could certainly be done without a great deal of increased time with technologies.
Absolutely. And so then we move along to another excuse that I hear a lot. And this one is usually said in hushed tones, which is, what is the role of a therapist? What is the role of a physical therapist, occupational therapist, SLP, allied health, if these machines are taking over? So if your patient is doing this when they're away and they're not around, what is he doing with the therapist? What becomes important for the therapist to do with the patient when they're not playing these restorative video games?
I really struggle with these kind of questions because they're so baffling to me. No, really, it would be like saying, what's the point of a cardiologist now that we have stethoscopes and EKGs and echocardiograms? Because the patient can go down to get an echo, or they can get an EKG when the cardiologist is not there. So what's the point of the cardiologist? I mean, it's just so bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
that I just can't understand it. I mean, let's
Do you
be
think
very
part
what?
of the problem is that we're not teaching therapists how to use these tools like we teach cardiology? This is not taught in university, how to interact with motion capture technology and how to set up an Xbox or a gaming system that could be used for rehabilitation. Do you think that's part of the issue? Just a complete lack of expertise, so then it's not viewed as a tool of the trade?
Yeah, I mean, there are two ways into the answer. One is exactly that one, and we can get to that in a minute. But I just want to say something, I think, which is we're very interested in the biomedical complex and cure. We're less interested in care.
Mm-hmm.
And we make a stark distinction between care and cure. And the allied health sciences, they're mainly women. They're considered an afterthought after the surgery, after the medical procedure. Now we just have to, it's the equivalent of sewing them up afterwards. You give that to a lesser person and the surgeon walks out. The idea that a human being specialized in the holistic behavior of a patient and a way to train them to behave again in a safe way in their environment, and the critical need to know how to do that being downplayed is astonishing. So by irony and paradox, that critical skill, which is really complex, has been circumscribed, simplified, and then locked into place technologically and scientifically. It's almost as though one of the most important things that could ever happen between a patient and a clinician has been turned into a lesser version of itself that is so insecure that it doesn't want to realize that it's the most important profession in the hospital, which I believe it is. So in other words, what we need is to reinvent what it is to be someone who can touch and hold and train and integrate a patient back into their lives across all three levels of, the International Classification of Functioning, the levels of impairment, activity, and participation. So I think what's happened is that it's like in the movies where somebody has latent superpowers, they're the chosen one, and they don't realize that they are, right? And I would like therapists to realize that given with what science is telling us and with what technology can offer and the critical importance of behavioral intervention and human-to-human contact, regardless of technology, that actually therapists are the chosen ones, and they're the ones who could make huge differences to outcomes that go far beyond what pharmacology is doing. So I think what we need to do is to sort of reinstill their sense that they're fundamental to the trajectory of a patient and make them understand that they're just going to be given better and better tools, just like all the other medical specialties are given better and better tools, without even remotely making you expendable. In fact, I believe profoundly that you will never take humans out of the loop if you want true creative behavioral interventions that will lead to true recovery. I really do.
Mm-hmm.
And are there moments where the patients can do things on their own? Yeah, right. But that's true of all the other medical professions. When they take their antihypertensive or statin at home, are you there when they pop the pill as a doctor? No, right? Are you there when they take their own blood pressure? No. So in other words, I think our job, David, to be quite honest, is to make people who are in the professions to holistically intervene at the level of behavior, to make them understand that they are the vanguard of interventions for neurological disease. I really do. It's just that perception is out of insecurity, and it's just wrong.
I agree. I really like the way that you framed the way many of our allied health professionals, their role is minimized. Their role in recovery is minimized. I think it's further minimized that, one of the most frustrating things that I hear in neurophysio is, it's more of an art than a science. I want to bang my head against the wall, but I hear it so often. I'm like, no, don't further minimize the skill of an exceptional neurophysio by saying what they're doing is an art. What they're doing is a very well calibrated science, and that is why their patients are getting better, because they're following the research.
I mean, just to drill down on this again, another anecdote. I have a therapist who joined our research group, Sandra. I know you've met her, and she decided to do a PhD with me. Okay, and she's an exceptional therapist. and she is doing a PhD in motor control and in rehabilitation. And what's incredibly interesting is to see this young clinician and scientist have to grapple with this very complex interface between neuroscience and technology beginning to make people feel that impairment reduction is possible at the behavioral level, and then mesh that with all the things that one has learned tacitly and explicitly in school to help patients at the level of activity and participation at function level to get home as soon as possible. So there's a genuine tension in the minds of this next gen between taking the new and combining it with the wisdom of the ages and finding a new synthesis, right? And it's and the upper limb is an incredible sort of, I shouldn't say battlefield, but it's sort of a ground upon which to have this dialogue between it, technology aided impairment reduction and hands-on participation and activity training. I believe out of that meshing, out of that dialogue within the minds of the next generation of therapists, that you're going to get a new cadre of therapists who are going to change the nature of the experience for patients, because impairment is now really going to be the goal. And then, of course, what's going to have to happen is it's going to have to be combined with new economic structures to make that realistic, right? Because you can't just discharge the patient after 4 or 5 days. And, we're doing studies at Johns Hopkins with, we call it fourth hour. You do your regular therapy, and then you go in and do impairment-based stuff for the upper limb. So I think it's a very exciting moment to completely rejuvenate those fields. And then, the final point is that I think other clinicians, MDs, and should also be doing behavioral interventions, right? In other words, I think we just have to have the whole medical profession understand that behavioral intervention is important. And as soon as you do that, you're going to expand the number of people who do it and completely change the perception and the content of what therapists do. I mean, you could have a kind of revolution here, but the only way we're going to have an exciting revolution, and this is a critical point, is to stop thinking that this is about technology versus human clinicians. That is just an utterly false way to frame it, in my view. And I hate to go on about it, but we just mustn't start the whole thing with that assumption, because it's just wrong.
Agreed entirely. And because this is what we want, right? We in our minds, we want here's the complex patient and here's the single silver bullet that solves the complex patient, as opposed to rolling up our sleeves and doing everything that is required in combination to make them better. And I think that on a lot of fronts, we're seeing really interesting things emerging. I even think in the field of, as we start to see psychedelics as a field emerge, I find it so fascinating and instructive, because finally the whole field of psychiatry is having to face the fact that we're saying, here is a medication that must be paired with a behavioral intervention in order to be effective. Otherwise, you're just giving someone a psychotropic medicine and leaving them to go on their way.
I mean, psychedelics are fascinating, right? I mean, I'm being swept up in it too. I find it fascinating. I mean, you're absolutely correct. The psychedelics are very interesting. They're sort of like behavior in a form of a pill. They're sort of this strange hybrid where many people who are very into pharmacology are now into psychedelics because they feel like they're getting their behavioral cake and eat it in the form of a kind of experience that is pharmacological. But as you say, it's almost certainly necessary to then, either combine that or complement with a behavioral intervention. And, one of the great mysteries of psychedelics is that you can get these lasting effects with one-time doses, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a very interesting space because, like a Necker cube, psychedelics oscillate between being traditional pharma and being something far more that feels behavioral. And I think this is going to play out very interestingly. I wanted to just say, just again on this whole issue, give another anecdote. When I was running the units again, there was a young police officer from, one of the Emirates, and he'd had a massive hemorrhage and was essentially vegetative as far as the people who had transferred him to us were concerned. And he had an amazing family. He had a wife, a small daughter, 2 brothers, mother, father. They were all there at the bedside. And at the time that I came on service, there had been plans were afoot to have him transferred back, either in the US to some sort of step down, subacute facility, or back to one of the Emirates. And I was noticing when I would walk in that there were moments of what seemed to be little lucid phases where he seemed to fixate on his wife. He seemed to respond above chance to certain questions and instructions. And so I said to the team, I said, we might as well just keep him here. He's got this amazing family looking after him. He's getting all the stimulation. We can get more therapy for him. And, it's going to be paid for, right? There's a wealthy source of funding. Not that was obviously not why I was doing it. And I said, it will be good for everyone here to get a sense of the natural history of TBI in a young person, because, of course, you don't know what the natural history is because he's gone within a week or two and you have no idea what his trajectory would be. So I said, let's keep him. And of course, there was consternation. I had to go to the chairman. I had to make the case. And of course, I was given permission. And we kept him for months. It was definitely 2 or 3 months later, when I was long off service, I was walking through one of the, on the first floor of the hospital. And this young man came up to me and put his hand on my shoulder. And I went, who's this? Right? It was him with his family, walking around, talking. Right? Now, I can assure you, everyone thought that he was going to remain vegetative and he should be transferred out. But what the lesson there was, he was young, he was under 45, which we know is a kind of a critical age for TBI. I had looked at his scans and could see that he had brain left. We did micro examinations of him neurologically and saw every day that there was a delta. He was getting an enormous amount of care from his family and from the therapist. We upped it. And it was a remarkable trajectory. Now, again, no one believes in that because no one sees it anymore. And then, of course, you go to a subacute facility where you get less and less. And then, of course, as the New England Journal called it, you get rehabbed to death. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So in other words, we need the entire philosophy of the care of nervous system injury and what incremental, high-intensity, high-dose training does over days, weeks, and months, right? And have better ways to measure, have many different types of team member. But what I'm talking about here, it just sounds like heresy, right? In other words, this whole mindset is just not what and, just to say that it doesn't sound like complete idealism, one of the ideas is that maybe with technology and continuing tracking across the continuum of care, even when you are discharged from an acute stroke unit, you could to some degree reproduce this several month stay in an acute unit like that, which may not scale, which may not be feasible. But at least you can say that there's that potential. And surely we can find ways using technology and science and people to reproduce that in a scalable way.
Yeah.
Right? But that's what we need. You see, David, it's just the whole thing has to change.
Agreed. Scalable way is a good hook because, as we sort of discussed earlier, you and I both have had experience in high performance, and your approach certainly does not sound like heresy when we're dealing with, my time working for an NBA team or for Red Bull and their high performance division.
Right.
Or for, any of the high performance athletes I've worked with. It's not heresy to say round the clock, there is going to be somebody literally feeding you, the nutrition that you need that is optimized for you and giving you hydration and doing your rehab. And you're going to have a doctor who's checking in on your moment to moment change of status. Really, not only do we know that approach works and that approach is highly effective at restoring someone to a previous level of ability, or in fact, even enhancing their ability after the incident. We know that it's possible. We just don't make it financially feasible for everybody for obvious reasons. So then the next question is, how can we create a care team like that through technology that can be scaled to the masses? Rather than denying that it works, because yes, I totally agree that there wants to be a lot of denial that this is not even a valid approach. It's a waste of resources, but it's not a waste of resources. We know that it works. So the next question is, how do we scale it?
There are many ways. First of all, for me, I've always thought to myself, there are 24 hours in the hospital, and then regular rehab involves an hour of OT, an hour of PT, an hour of speech. And I've always thought to myself, well, what about the other 21 hours? Surely there's a way to add to the behavioral experience within those 24 hours. Now, we have just completed a pilot study in the stroke unit at Hopkins, where we created an immersive room, which you know very well all about, and patients were led to do, after they'd had their other things that they needed to have done clinically, to that room to do, up to an hour and a half of extra upper limb therapy. We've now finished 20 patients. They can do it. It's feasible. You can bring them, and you can steadily titrate up the amount of time they can do it. There are systems approaches. Mona Bahuth, she's a stroke neurologist at Hopkins, has done a remarkable job trying to do a kind of systems analysis so that the flow during the day is such that you can actually use these extra hours in the day. Okay, so one answer to your question is, can you fit it into the day in a structural way? And the answer is yes. The question then is what is it that you install? And we can talk about the type of approaches. We've already talked about the nighttime study. Then we can talk about the rooms. And then you have to think about, well, what's the extra training required and how do you pay for it?
Yeah.
Right. These are problems that have been solved before in other areas of medicine. I mean, right, we have dialysis units, we have heart transplants, we have chemotherapy, we have MRI scanners, right? As technologies come along, we have found ways to use it and we found ways to pay for it. There's no difference here, in my view, except that behavioral interventions take longer. And that's what puts people off. They don't want people to be athletes or students with the kind of time that athletes and students are given. They want something quicker, faster. But that's what we're going to have to get over. I think your point is a critical point. I think it's the take-home point of the whole podcast, really, is treat each patient as an athlete that needs that type of attention to detail and that amount of training. That's what one should think about. The nervous system is going to have to be treated with the respect that a professional athlete accords their body when they're training. That's what it's going to have to be. And we're simply going to have to find a way to pay for the technology and the time and the staff to do it. And does it scale? Well, yeah, it scales just the way that MRI scanners are everywhere. They scale.
Yep.
CAT scanners scale. Chest x-rays scale. There are little operating rooms everywhere. They scale, right? So emergency rooms scale, right? So I don't quite see how we can't do the same thing. Schools scale, kindergarten scale, gyms scale. I just don't think that we have the mindset for it. I think the only thing that has to expand is people's imagination in the chemical, medical, industrial complex. We just have to take a feather out of the cap of what you said, the professional athletes.
I mean, in terms of getting people the standard of care that they need, I mean, I hope that this is not my career legacy, but I will say categorically, up until now, I think the most impact that I've had on quality of care has been from sitting back and working with a team on how can we intelligently structure and string together a set of CPT codes, a set of billing codes in a novel way that allows therapists to have the amount of time that they need to provide the adequate standard of care that we're demanding, while still being reimbursed at a significant level. So I do think that there is a place for, because what I'm learning about all health systems is oftentimes that isn't done. They're like, look, we got 2 or 3 billing codes that we know the insurers are going to cover, and we're just going to keep dropping these billing codes and create a factory, and we're not going to change any of what we do. We're just going to do it this way. For change to occur, first you need to use the tools you have, which we know that we have billing codes that can be reshuffled and rechanged. I think the other challenge is that we need technologies that actually have a good faith basis of working, right? And you and I recently published a piece about the prospects of new technologies to bring about a needed revolution in NeuroRehab. Let's talk a little bit about that. Like, where are the holes here, and what are we doing wrong? What are we doing right to get good new technologies in front of therapists?
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to this notion of therapists, I mean, it's difficult, right? Because on the one hand, if one doesn't expand the definition of what a behavioral interventionalist is and maybe reinvent the profession and bring maybe new people into it, the danger is with what you're saying is if you still keep putting everything that comes along under the 1 hour, 1 hour, 1 hour umbrella,
Yeah.
Bill for the therapist, everything has to be squeezed into this pre-existing model. And so what happens, right, is any new technology, because it's forced to be used within that framework of an hour of OT, an hour of PT, which, as you know, ends up being far less in terms of total minutes, the technologies can't spread their wings, and because they need hours and hours and hours and hours of time to be used properly. So then you're in this extremely unfortunate catch-22 situation, which is if you try and piggyback on existing timeframes and codes, then very few technologies can possibly breathe within that constricted time frame. They fail, but they fail because they were never meant to last, to be used for such a short period of time. There's this horrible situation where the trials are done, as you well know, with far more therapy. So let's take robotics, which I'm not a huge fan of, but the robotic trials, some of them at least, really tried to increase the intensity of dose of high limb training and saw some signal. It wasn't super impressive, but there was some signal. But then the companies were fully aware that when they then sold this technology commercially, that the therapists would never use the technology under the trial conditions. They would simply use them for 5, 10, 15 minutes as a dessert during their regular session. Another more up-to-date example, it's dear to two of our hearts, is vagal nerve stimulation. Vagal nerve stimulation is running into trouble now, right? Because the trial was not super impressive. It was like robotics, not a huge effect size. Patients had to have something rather large and unwieldy implanted, and then they had to have it combined with much more therapy than is usually given. The company, and like the other companies, realized that they could then sell the device outside the context of the increased therapy that was given during the trial, which is absolutely true. The FDA will allow you to use the technology outside the context of the behavioral intervention used in the trial. And again, we're going to almost certainly see even less impressive results under those conditions. And the therapist will consider yet another technology has bitten the dust. Okay, so in other words, the only danger with what you're saying, which is to sort of try and piggyback and exploit current codes and ways to pay therapists, is that because the timeframes are so completely off, everything that comes through that is promising will be seen as a failure. So my guess is we're going to have to find a way, either you have a new generation of therapists who do spend 3, 4, 5 hours with one patient just for the upper limb, or you find a way to combine their time with, another set of human beings that may not have to be fully fledged therapists, plus technology. So, you could have a series of rooms with immersive gaming in them, and you could have, technicians and therapists, and you could basically rotate and see how things are going. But my guess is if technology is going to have the effect on impairment that you and I think it can be, then you're going to have to break free of current ways to pay therapists the amount of time that they get allotted to them. So I don't know how one does that. Either they get changed, or you have to have a new set of humans that complement them that can increase the amount of time spent with the patients. You see what I'm saying? That's my big concern.
I totally agree. And when we think about utilizing new billing codes and things like that, there is potential for that with the remote therapeutic monitoring billing codes that are available, because you can have a rehab technician or a PTA monitoring progress of someone away interacting with the technology and spending hours on the technology, and having the PTA tweak difficulty and repetitions and so on and so forth on the back end. This becomes possible there are still a lot of issues that need to be solved on the financial side of things. There are issues related to just the simple capital expenses of these systems and having hospitals able to afford them up front because the billing codes don't pay for that. There are, as you mentioned, training costs and so on and so forth. But I agree entirely with what you said, that we need to turn the whole system on its head and stop expecting big effect sizes to come out of small interventional windows, because that's just not how the nervous system works, and that's not how behavioral interventions work.
As you know, with all the excitement that there currently is about epidural stimulation of the spinal cord and spinal cord injury, people forget that when the stimulator is implanted, the patients spend months on doing 2 to 3 hour sessions almost every day of the week for months on a treadmill, right? Massive amounts of, athlete level degrees of practice.
Yeah.
Right. So my feeling is we're going to have to just expand, the clinical coaching class, right? Yeah. The number of professions that come under the umbrella of training, right? Yeah. So that you can do that kind of training. And I just don't know whether one would unwittingly fall into a local minima by using existing codes, which are still very much within those constrained time intervals, as you said, and we get caught. In other words, we got as much of the slack out of the system as we could. We call that optimal. And I've seen that. I remember speaking to a hospital in Germany where they felt that if they could just squeeze the sponge to its ultimate dryness and just get as much of the slack out of the system, they were better than everybody else. Rather than saying, well, no, you're not going to be able to climb up an even taller tree to get to the moon. You have to do something different. Right?
Yeah.
And so that's my concern. By all means, let's see whether we can revamp current therapy reimbursement and using codes, but we need to sort of have a way to bring a whole new philosophy and type of training in codes that allows somebody to do 2 to 3 hours a day for months, right?
Yes.
You see, and I just don't know whether trials with technology showing evidence for that are going to be enough of an impetus to break open the system in the way that you and I want it.
And for all insurers who say no to this, we're going to say your children get to go to the special school where you only get 45 minutes of instruction every day, and that's it.
Yeah,
that's all you need, because that's what you're telling us we need to reshape a nervous system. 45 minutes a day, 3 days a week.
I think your point you made earlier is that you and I have two very, very hard jobs, right? One is to combine the science and the technology with change in practice, like we've been discussing, and then we have to be the extraordinarily good psychotherapists to the medical profession, and teach them that behavioral interventions have incredible lasting benefits in any medical condition, right? The nervous system demands it, but I think that that's true. I've said this to you before, right? Everyone was extremely proud of the vaccines for COVID, but no one really said, well, how come we haven't cured the hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and sedentary living that led to all those deaths in northern Italy and Bergamo and then around the world? There are still hundreds of people dying every day of COVID because of their comorbidities. Why haven't those been solved as fast as the vaccine was developed? I never seen an article anywhere saying, why haven't we solved hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and sedentary living in 2 years? Well, we got a vaccine in 2 years. What's the problem, right? And no one seems to ask that question. Maybe someone's asked you that question. When you say, well, because the answer is those conditions are behavioral intervention requiring conditions, they're not going to have something made by Moderna that's going to just be popped into their mouth or injected into them. They go, oh, okay, it's different. The question doesn't even get asked. Have you ever been asked, why haven't we solved the problems as fast as getting the vaccine itself?
No, the only way I've been asked that question is in a totally different kettle of fish, which is in the context of long COVID. Similarly, does not have a reductionist solution. It requires better understanding of multiple aspects of complex chronic illness. But yeah, I mean, I think
yes, exactly.
ultimately, fundamentally, the same point, which is the hard things require both behavioral health as well as pharmacological intervention, and rehab comprises a large part of that. And we're constantly, again, to your earlier point, we're constantly trying to disrespect rehab. We're constantly trying to say one day there will be a pill that replaces you. But when you actually understand the complexity of what you're trying to do, that's complete nonsense. In fact, I'd say anybody who says that there is one pill that is going to solve this problem fundamentally doesn't understand the problem they're trying to solve.
I mean, the way I teach students, I say, look, if I were to tell you take this pill and tomorrow you'll be a concert level violinist, anyone who knows a little bit of neuroscience will know that that's impossible. So they know, oh yeah, I can't, like in the Matrix, you're a helicopter pilot, you're a pianist. Right? They understand it makes no sense in a healthy nervous system to be able to do that. But as soon as you get to a damaged one, that kind of magical thinking suddenly seems to be allowed, right? They cross over into thinking there's something feasible there. It's very odd.
It is
right?
odd.
So,
despite the fact that,
it's strange.
Should be harder, not easier.
It should be harder, not easier, right? It's extremely odd. And there are, we don't have to go into it, sort of theories about levels that you can sort of explain why that happens, right? What I would say, just for us to sort of be practical, is my dream is you'll have multiple behavioral professions. There was a remarkable article in the New Yorker during COVID about these teams on motorbikes in Costa Rica checking in on patients around the country, right? Almost like a commando team, right? And they were a mixture of IT, nursing, and therapy, right? It was almost like a new profession, right? Which I find very exciting. When David Graeber wrote his book, Bullshit Jobs, people sitting in cubicles doing the equivalent of digging a hole and filling it up again, that you could really train people in this mixture. They'd be like EMTs plus, and you'd have this incredible, commando unit, SWAT team for looking after people in place. And the dream would be that you'd have hospitals, you'd have high streets with pop-up immersive rooms that you go into, just like you go into a supermarket, a hairdresser, or an optician. And then you'd have home visits. And you create this network of ongoing technology-inflected behavioral intervention at all those locations along the continuum of care. And it would be lifelong. We just finished a trial in Portugal of 30 Parkinson's patients who came in 3 times a week for an hour of gameplay for 12 weeks, and they enjoyed it. Now, there are challenges. Do they have to have a van? How do they get there? What happens to them afterwards? But it's definitely doable. Mm-hmm. It's incredibly inspiring. The only way we're going to do this is to be, generate the evidence and then somehow, persuade the entrenched clinicians who should be our allies, right, David? I mean, they shouldn't be fighting us.
No.
And then we have to make the economic case, the political case. It's very, very difficult, but there's no alternative. And the weapon that we have is better science and better technology. It's going to allow us to have a better chance to win this battle. Wouldn't you agree that there's a moment now where we can do this because we have better weapons?
Yes, there are a lot of challenges. I mean, and even, as you say, the political challenges, the entrenched ableism of, if you're an older adult who's had a stroke, what is the point of even, getting them back to a level of function if they're not contributing to the economy and they're not, doing all of these things. I couldn't believe it, but there's this Senate political race in Pennsylvania, and I received 4 calls asking for comment about whether or not someone who's had a stroke, who is using an assistive technology to interpret questions after his stroke, could be fit to be a senator.
Well, it's funny. We're on. You and I've been interviewed 4 times now about Fetterman.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating that there were 2 lines of questioning. One was, is he cognitively intact despite his difficulty expressing language? One. And then the other one was, is it okay if you're cognitively intact to require some kind of aid? And what I pointed out to them is I said, you need to keep those completely orthogonal to each other, right? Mm-hmm. Is he cognitively intact? And I said, yes. Language and thinking are not the same. put that aside. Now, are you really saying that he shouldn't be able to use some sort of prompting device? In other words, a deaf senator could never use hearing aids. A senator in a wheelchair could never use a ramp, right? Let's just get rid of all those things.
Yep.
Right? Any senator with a pacemaker in, remove it.
Yep.
Right? Is that the way you want to go? It's outrageous.
Yes.
Right? And
this is a challenge, right?
yeah.
Because this is how people think about disability, and part of the fight always has to be battling this entrenched ableism of how much money is worth spending to make someone well again.
Or, I mean, there are three versions of this, right? I think it's
Yeah.
important for listeners. Right? One is to use technology to try and fix people so they can go back into the normal world. Okay, so that's the ultimate. Can you reduce impairment sufficiently to get people to go back into the normal world? They're sufficiently fixed. Then you have technology that can allow you to go back into the normal world, but the technology is not fixing you, it's assisting you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So in other words, like the work we're doing on spinal cord stimulation in chronic stroke, it may well be, just like in DBS for Parkinson's disease, that you need a permanent
okay. Device
but so in other words, you're not fixed, but you're aided, but in both cases, they allow you to go back into the normal world. And then there's the third, which is, should we be using technologies to create new worlds, right, who are neither fixed nor assisted, but the quality of their life in this new world, avatar-like, suits them? Should we be using technology to create worlds that increase the quality of life? In other words, it's an Umwelt, using the German term, designed for your disability. You know, I just saw a movie, I don't know if you saw it, which I recommend everyone see, called Sound of Metal. I don't know if you saw that movie. It's an amazing movie about a drummer who loses his hearing because of, and this young man, this, you know, alternative musician, tattooed and wild, is suddenly thrown into the world of disability and having to cope with being deaf. And there's a very interesting treatment of going to a community to learn to be deaf, or whether to try and get cochlear implants. And, you know, that's a can of worms. I have no interest in going into it. But I think this film very beautifully touches all the themes that we've been talking about today, right? Is what rights do you have to live in the new world that your disability has given you? And can technology be used simply to allow you to enjoy your disability and spend, you know, every now and then you move into the real world and you go back to your new world? Or do we only want to have technologies that fix you or assist you so that you can go back into the real world? And if you can't, like in the case of the senator, banish them. You can't be in the Senate. You don't belong here.
I think obviously, I know that you know this, but the terms fixed and normal are not what, you know, I know that we both believe in the third world, the fact that we create the third idea, which is we create new worlds for everybody. By creating new worlds, the sort of able-bodied world, or should we say temporarily able-bodied world, doesn't seem to capture, even though every time we do it, you know, it's happened over and over again. Every time you create a new world, it becomes for everybody, and it enhances the world of the able-bodied folks and the
absolutely. I mean, I agree. There's such a massive failure of
teaching that lesson over and over again, which is
this. I mean, there's a failure of imagination, failure of imagination, failure of concepts, failure of vocabulary, failure to respect. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's all true. But I do think it's important to know that to the degree that technology and science are allowing it, we can increase the probability of spending some more time able-bodied. And I think that that option, without any ideological baggage attached to it, should be made available.
Made available.
And I think that it's exciting that the same technologies and concepts can be used to increase the probability of moving back to a more able-bodied state, but also to greatly enhance the quality of life in the disabled state. Right? In other words, it's just not what's taught in medical schools and elsewhere. It's impoverished. It's impoverished, wouldn't you say? It's just an impoverished, reductionist education that doesn't see the enormous scope for a multiplicity of solutions.
And an anecdote of my own is I have two individuals with spinal cord injury that I work with and see on a regular basis that are both high C, meaning, for those listening, meaning that they don't have any voluntary movement of their arms or their legs. One would interact with any technology that will bring back function, would be willing to do any sort of surgery that would allow them to re-enter the able-bodied world. And the other is full of disability pride, is constantly communicating to me that a series of worlds opened up to them because of their spinal cord injury, and they love who they are as a result of their injury, and they would not choose to participate in interventions that had a chance of bringing back upper and lower extremity function. And again, to your point, both are valid. Both viewpoints are valid. Both viewpoints are deeply personal. But who are we to not offer? Why would we not be fighting every step of the way to offer these opportunities to individuals who want these technologies to?
I mean, and it's just, I was just, co-hosting a very exciting meeting on trying to do something about cerebellar ataxia. My mother has cerebellar ataxia, right? She has a slowly progressive cerebellar ataxia, and she has to be extremely careful on surfaces. And now, if I were to say to my mother, look, we can either go to cities that are flatter, go to places where you can walk and feel safe, or you have to agree to have an implantable cerebellar unit put in you at the age of 84 to see if it can help you reverse your cerebellar ataxia. I mean, it would be completely ridiculous to say, if you're not willing to go through the jump through the technological hoops required to have it reversed with some implantable device, versus trying to create spaces where you, even with your cerebellar ataxia, can feel the joy of movement and participation. I mean, it would be insanity, right? And I would be just as proud. And I said, by the way, just at this meeting, that the two things that should be tried, and I've been interested to hear what you say, are, yes, by all means, let's try and make a prosthetic cerebellum. Let's have cerebellar ataxia have its DBS moment. But on the other end of the spectrum, let's create cerebellar care centers, glorious places where you can go and greatly enjoy your ataxia, right? An arcade for neurological disease. And technology could be used for both those ends, a kind of return to being able-bodied and a joyous immersion despite or because of your ataxia, right? And I remember when I said it, those are the two things that should be done, right?
Mm-hmm.
People thought there was something contradictory in that.
Yeah.
Some people did. Do you see? It's fascinating.
No,
It's John Maynard Keynes said, in the end, we're all dead. Why can't we use science and technology for the care of the self, as Foucault called his book, from the spectrum of the able to the disabled, and be equally imaginative in both? Expand the professions that way. I mean, that's what I'd like to see, David. I mean, I think we just need to revamp everything. But of course, I'm going to agree with you that we can start by being pragmatic with existing codes. And my feeling is that unless you sort of make people see the size of your ambition, people will get bored.
Yes, exactly what you just said is that we need to show people a vision of something disruptive. We need to show people a vision of something that really gets them to understand that there is more to what we're planning and more to what we're bringing to the table than sit down and do 100 repetitions of this movement and we'll get you to a sort of a state that isn't really satisfactory for anyone. It's not celebrating disability, and it's not curing disability. It's just
and human beings are like that. I mean, look at Elon Musk with all his big projects.
Oh, come on.
People respond to that. No,
let's
but
talk about real innovators.
No. But what I'm saying is that people psychologically respond to big projects.
Yes.
And what I'm saying is audacious vision. And I'm saying that this project is big, and in this case, it's actually worthy, but it needs audacity. And we need to be able to transmit both the good that it will do and the excitement that it generates. We mustn't just sound pragmatic. We have to say that the science and the technology and the will have reached a point where you could do something big and audacious and help a huge number of people. And in the end, everyone gets older and less able, right? So, I'm going to end by feeling optimistic, but I think we have to have a revolutionary state of mind, you and I.
We'll end up being optimistic because that's not how we always end some of our chats. But thank you.
Thank you, David. That was fun.
Yeah. No, thank you.
This is Disrupting Innovation with Dr. David Petrino.